Hello and welcome to our 47th web debate. I think the topic for today could not be more timely because we are looking at current diplomatic responses to COVID-19, and we will focus on two aspects in particular. We will look at what has been discussed and what has been happening at the Human Rights Council, and we will also take a very close look at the COVAX facility. I'm really glad to have two excellent speakers to have this discussion and to start unpacking this topic. So allow me to very briefly introduce them. We have with us Ambassador Umash Bhatia, who is Singapore's permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva. He joined the Singaporean Foreign Office in 1996. And prior to coming to Geneva, he was Singapore's first resident ambassador to the United Arab Emirates and served as Director General in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Our second speaker for today is an expert in human rights. So we welcome Mr. Mark Lyman, who is the Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group, which is a think tank focused on international human rights policy with offices in Geneva, New York, and Bogota. Prior to founding the Universal Rights Group in 2013, he actually worked as a diplomat in the Human Rights Council. So I'm really looking forward to this debate with two speakers who could not be a better fit for this kind of topic. Before I start entering into a dialogue with them, let me remind you, our audience, that this debate is meant to be as interactive as possible. This means we're looking for your comments and questions, and we will bring them into the discussion at several points in our debate. For this, I have help. My colleague Pavlina Ittelsen will be taking a very close look at what's happening in the chat here on Zoom, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. So for your questions and comments, please don't hold back, put them in the chat, and we will bring them in the debate as soon as possible. But I think without further ado, because there's a lot to discuss and we only have 45 minutes, I would like to turn to our speakers for some initial questions to kind of give us a context and to lead us into the discussion. And here I turn in particular to Ambassador Bhatia to kind of give us a sense about the COVAX facility. What is its importance, and perhaps at this point, what is your overall assessment of COVAX?
Well, Katrina, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to join you today in this very timely discussion, as you said. And I'm delighted to have Mark Lyman, my good friend. We don't always see eye to eye on things, but I certainly respect his perspective, very much value. So it'll be a great, interesting discussion. Let me first say that Singapore has been an early supporter of the COVAX facility. In fact, it's not often, well known, but we were perhaps the first, if not among the first countries, to sign on to it, to sign on the expression of interest last year. And we founded the informal Friends of the COVAX facility, COVAX group, which we co-chaired with Switzerland. We did this. This is an informal cross-regional grouping comprised of about 15 members that early on catalyzed discussions last summer, actually, in a series of virtual meetings across various time zones to operationalize COVAX facility. So we have that sort of role which we played, and WHO Director General Dr. Tedros recognized that Singapore and the Friends of the Facility for COVAX played a key role in turning the vision of the COVAX facility into reality. So we're happy to have been part of that. And we believe in that. It's what my Prime Minister calls not vaccine diplomacy, not vaccine nationalism, but vaccine multilateralism. So that was a key part. I just want to say quickly, by way of introduction, COVAX, what it's about. I mean, it's 5 letters that are bandied about quite often. And if you really want to say, what is it at the bottom? It's if you've got a fire and the virus is like a fire, SARS-CoV-2 is like a fire, you basically need to find some way to put out the fire. And the COVAX facility is a kind of fire brigade with a fire extinguisher that was put together as the fire was burning. And it tried to be the most, I would say, fair and equitable fire brigade that worked out a scheme of how to sort of like help put out the fires for the most vulnerable, the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, with a goal of getting the pandemic under control. So that's really the easiest way of looking at it. At the same time, there were what we can call bilateral fire brigades or national fire brigades that did their own thing, where they worked with a particular pharmaceutical developer and a manufacturer and did bilateral deals. But COVAX was always supposed to be to say, look, we need to put this out together in a collective effort. And it's what Richard Hatchett of CEPI, one of the co-conveners of COVAX, he's called the equity clock. What was so important about getting COVAX started. And when we were talking early on, when we were speaking early on with Gavi, CEPI, these are the global health actors that worked with the WHO, these so-called PPPs. When we were working with them early on last year, that whether it was Seth Barkley of Gavi or Richard of CEPI, the key thing was there's an urgency. The clock was running down. And the fear was that vaccines, the scramble for vaccines, at that time, very scarce and unproven with various technologies. Now we're a bit further along. That time, there was this fear that the scramble for resources would make it difficult to ensure equitable response because no one is safe till everyone is safe. You heard all of that. So I wanted to just break that down. And the key thing to note is that COVAX is part, and I can share a little bit more about COVAX in a stint, but COVAX is part of the so-called Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, Act A. And Act A, so COVAX, the vaccines pillar is there. You've got the therapeutics pillar, you've got the diagnostics pillar, and then the health system strengthening. So COVAX became operational last October, and many of its deliveries via UNICEF in January 2021. And I want to just give you one more thought. Again, everyone knows that I'm happy to talk about all the standard figures. You know, they aim to deliver 2 billion by 2021 to 200 countries, how many participants it has. But actually, a lot of it is we are building this fire brigade, even as this multilateral fire brigade, so to use my metaphor, even as the fire is raging. And the way the first shipment of COVAX facilities went to Ghana is also a very interesting story because it was literally involved diverting an aeroplane to Dubai to pick up syringes, to pick up the COVAX vaccines and bring them to Ghana. So it's literally, and we still haven't got vaccines. You know, this week we're going to have potentially more vaccines added to the COVAX mix because you've got some Chinese vaccines being considered for WHO. EUL. So it's a moving picture with COVAX and it's a very fluid picture. So I'll stop there and happy to share more details and cede the floor to my good friend, Mark Lyman, with your permission, or to you. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I actually have a direct follow-up question because I'm particularly interested in the role of diplomacy and diplomatic efforts. And you already mentioned COVAX as a multilateral effort. And of course, there are other efforts going on, bilateral ones. But I'm particularly interested in kind of the dynamics of diplomacy or diplomatic practice behind bringing about the COVAX facility. And you already mentioned it, the so-called friends of the COVAX facility. And I think you also mentioned that Singapore played quite a prominent role in that. So I would be really interested to hear first a bit more about the friends of the COVAX facility and perhaps your approach through this and your assessment of this diplomatic effort in supporting COVAX and even perhaps bringing about the COVAX facility.
Sure. Well, I'll put it this way. There was a concept, and that concept was shaped by some very sharp minds in global health. And whether they were from Gavi or CEPI or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or from Wellcome Trust, you know, some very sharp minds or Norway, and they put this together, this concept. And Gavi, as you know, and I mean, they've always been involved in vaccines, in subsidizing and rolling out vaccines to the LMICs, less developed countries. So there's always been a role there for them. But for the first time, under the COVAX scheme, they had a two-tiered process. So you have what they call the AMC, the Advanced Manufacturing Commitment, which is for the 92 countries that get vaccines subsidized through ODA and through private sector and philanthropy. And then you have a self-financing part. And that was very interesting. Gavi had never done that before. This was never done before. And that self-financing part, where you are dealing with countries who are contracting to buy full price vaccines, was really very, very, I would say, challenging to design. And what we said is, look, we need to basically be the sounding board for these global health groups, the WHO. We need to work with them and say there are many issues, indemnity, there's the sort of vaccine access, the pricing, many issues which we can talk about. So Singapore got together a group of countries which we thought can help discuss where the self-financing countries stand, what are their common concerns, and also to see, very importantly, how we can support the AMC component of COVAX to ensure that there was universal, equitable access. And I'm happy to talk about what universal, equitable means, because there are various distribution models, various allocation models, various sense of what is fair, what is equitable, so on and so forth, and the human rights part of it, which I'm happy to hear from Mark as well. But the key thing is, we got these countries together. We've got countries that were actually nominally sort of like not always talking. We got, we had, for example, Israel and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE and Korea and Japan. And we got the EU in, we got Australia and New Zealand. So we got this group in. We had 7 or 8 virtual meetings over the course of 4 months, very intense, different time zones. Some were clocking in at 6 in the morning. And we did it all virtually. And we invited Gavi, we invited Seppi, we had some real discussions and built some strong friendships with our global health ambassadors from capitals, talking and trying to shape multilateral diplomacy, not in the room, but on Zoom, and having to adapt to that. And after these meetings, you want to find out a diplomatic process. After these meetings, we'd follow up with WhatsApp, we'd follow up with emails, and we started to sort of continue to winnow and shape the process and create a consensus about how COVAX should be shaped. So that's how we are. Today, we have both streams that are operational, and they are part of a universal vaccine distribution scheme that UNICEF has put in place. So it's actually quite a fascinating story where we had to deal with the pandemic, work virtually, and somehow still come to some kind of, look, COVAX is not perfect. The vaccine distribution is now facing issues. There can be many debates about how you allocate, and I'm happy to go into that later, what was fair, what was equitable, but at least we got it rolling, and bearing in mind what I call the equity clock and the availability clock that Gavi and Seppi were so worried about as vaccines started to be bought up bilaterally. So I hope that helps in terms of contextualizing it.
Thank you so much. And what I also note is very interesting that the whole process, or part of the process, was virtual, as you mentioned. So to go back to your metaphor, we have a fire that needs to be put out. At the same time, we have to think about how do we even assemble the material to actually put out that fire. It's kind of a double burden for diplomatic practice. And that's what I find really interesting to kind of look at what COVID-19 is doing in that sense, being a very tremendous challenge, and at the same time, the diplomatic process itself needs to be renegotiated and reassembled, so to speak.
Exactly. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's like, there's a fire in your neighborhood and you can't go out and call people together. You have to go online and say, how do we deal with this fire? Can you get this bit of equipment? Can you get that bit of the equipment? And which part of the fire do we put up, and who do we actually save? As we're doing it all virtually, so to speak. And we continue to fight this fire, virtually or hybrid.
Exactly. And I think because you mentioned equitable, fair distribution of vaccines, I think this is an ideal moment to bring Mark Lyman into the discussion and to kind of focus on a very related but different venue, which is, of course, the Human Rights Council. So the 46th session of the Human Rights Council just ended, and the council obviously also addressed COVID, and there's a very specific resolution that calls on states to urgently support funding and close the funding gap on COVAX, so directly addressing the COVAX facility. But it also talks about ensuring equitable, affordable, timely, and universal access to COVID-19 vaccines. And I don't think there's anyone better than Mark to kind of give us an overview of what has been happening in the Human Rights Council and what we should make of that particular resolution. So Mark, what's your assessment?
Thank you. Good to be here and good to see you, Katerina, and good to see the ambassador as well. I'm not quite sure what he meant by we don't always agree with each other, because in my experience, we always do. It's Singapore and the Universal Rights Group that sometimes disagree, but the ambassador and I always see eye to eye.
I want to make the debate more interesting.
No, you're right. The Human Rights Council, as it should, has really taken a strong grip, or at least started to look very deeply at the issue of COVID-19, both in terms of response and recovery efforts and its impact on human rights. At the last session of the Human Rights Council, I think it was a good example of that. We did a calculation at the end of the session, at the end of the high-level segment of the session, which is where all the ministers and prime ministers and the important people come and speak. And COVID-19 and its human rights implications was the top, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the top issue raised by ministers and prime ministers. The Secretary General as well, of course, it featured very prominently in his high-level opening statement. The High Commissioner too, special procedures, made a joint statement. And as you mentioned, there was this resolution. So what did all of these people, important people, and this resolution say? Well, the main focus, and that's the topic that we're discussing today, was of course vaccine multilateralism or vaccine nationalism, both of which were mentioned in the resolution. It also, as you alluded to in your question, covered a number of other human rights issues related to COVID-19, such as the disproportionate impact on different parts of the population, people in pre-existing vulnerable or marginalized situation or positions, the particular impact on women, on persons with disabilities, on children when it comes to the right to education. But undoubtedly, the main focus of the resolution was on access to vaccines, equitable access to vaccines, and quite rightly so. And I think in the short time I have today, the one thing I would like to highlight from the resolution is that it really shows that the people behind it, which was largely the non-aligned movement, but also it involved Ecuador because they'd come forward with an earlier draft, and the ambassador of Singapore and others, proponents of this, really did an excellent job to get consensus on this resolution. Why? Because it encapsulates a big debate in the world of human rights. And that's the debate between, are human rights the sole responsibility of the state? So the right to health, right to life, when it comes to the response and the impact of a global pandemic. Is it, as Western states, or most Western states believe, essentially the responsibility of the state where the person lives or the people live? Or is there also a very strong element of that it's the responsibility of the international community, multilateralism, international cooperation? And interestingly, if you look at resolution 4614, 46/14, you can see both of these elements living in, let's say, uneasy harmony or balance. You have paragraphs which talk about the responsibility of states. You know, one of the PPs emphasizes the central role of the state in protecting and promoting human rights. But then elsewhere in the resolution, you have a clear recognition of the importance of international cooperation and multilateralism. And I think this is fascinating because this is on paper something we see playing out in the real world. And let's be honest here. I mean, the ambassador talked about difficulties with vaccine rollout, and are we living up to these ideals of vaccine multilateralism? And let's be quite frank, and I can maybe say this because I come from one of the countries guilty of vaccine nationalism, the United Kingdom, and we're not. I mean, you know, everybody, if you talk to the UK and the US or you listen to them, they talk about they've given this much to the COVAX facility. But, you know, giving to the COVAX facility is only part of the issue. Other issues are production of vaccines, it's the trade, it's export of vaccines. And the fact is, whereas the European Union, India, China have been exporting vaccines produced on their soil, the United States has exported almost nothing. Indeed, they've actually stockpiled vaccines that are not yet authorized to be used in the United States. And the United Kingdom hasn't exported a single dose and has ordered twice or three times as many doses as they need for the population. And this is very serious because, as the ambassador said, it's morally questionable or morally wrong, let's say. It goes against, in my view, the international responsibility of states when it comes to human rights, because it isn't only the responsibility of a person's own state. And it's short-sighted because, as the ambassador said, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And that's something that the former Prime Minister of Gordon Brown said, of course, last week. I'll stop there.
I have kind of a follow-up question, because you kind of alluded to it. So we have this Human Rights Council resolution, which in itself is very interesting, as you highlighted, because of this tension between state responsibility versus a kind of global responsibility. But I'm also wondering, and as I said, you alluded to this a little bit, having this resolution is well and good, but in addition, what are kind of the current challenges you see, or perhaps the challenges ahead, with this knowledge of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council has just ended? So what's next, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, your challenge is probably the right word. I mean, like all Human Rights Council resolutions, even international agreements, but certainly non-binding resolutions like Resolution 4614, the challenge always is implementation. Is it just rhetoric that sounds nice and looks good on paper, or is it actually a call to meaningful action? They're often UN human rights resolutions. Let's be kind and say they have a mixed record when it comes to implementation. And here, honestly, I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think Singapore, the others responsible for or involved in setting up COVAX, Gavi and others, also the work that Singapore and others done of promoting the idea of vaccine multilateralism. The delivery, as the ambassador said, seeing the first vaccines delivered to Ghana, for example. This is fantastic, and it's great that these people have succeeded in bringing the multilateral system to bear in something as vitally important as vaccine rollout. However, it's also coming up against barriers. And if your question is, am I optimistic about the degree to which the resolution of the Human Rights Council, even though it's an excellent resolution, and even though it was very timely as well, am I optimistic about the ability of that to break through the logjam? I'm not. Why? Because in the view of most states, even countries that are the founders of the United Nations, and especially with some of the leaders we have around the world at the moment, if it's a straight fight between internationalism and nationalism, nationalism will unfortunately win. And, many of the countries that are producing the vaccine, we're seeing that. Of course, they say that as soon as their own population is vaccinated, they will start exporting, but that's highly questionable position from a human rights viewpoint, when people should have access, including the world's poorest and those in vulnerable situations. And as I said before, morally questionable and also short-sighted. So I hope I'm wrong, but I do worry that these countries won't be shamed by this resolution into doing the right thing.
Can I add something to that, Katrina?
Yes, please. I was actually going to ask exactly that. So please go ahead.
So I actually think Mark has highlighted a very important tension in Resolution 4614 that someone has put up, between the responsibilities of states and of the international community. And that tension remains. And it's embedded in the resolution because that was part of the debate within, among the nation states. It is an important concept, I think, of national partiality. And the concept of national partiality is that a country's right and duty to prioritize its own citizens. Now, we also have, in this case, regional priority, a region, and we know which region we're talking about, a region's right and duty to prioritize its own regional citizens as part of the associative ties. And I think, so we have not only vaccine nationalism and vaccine multilateralism, but vaccine regionalism. That also has happened in this pandemic. But the question of national partiality, I mean, one can argue, and that goes along what Mark spoke about, the responsibilities of states, that the legitimate authority, the national authority, you can defend national partiality. An argument can be made. You can defend national partiality to say, well, it's a state's right to protect its citizens and its residents first and foremost. But how far do you extend this? And this leads to all sorts of ethical questions, human rights questions. How far do you extend national partiality? Can it go to the state where you say, well, even within my national policy, there's some countries who may have contracted with COVAX, but I have their bilateral deals, and they're saying we're only going to vaccinate our citizens and everyone else can wait. Now, Singapore has not done that. Just for information, we have made sure our migrant workers have been vaccinated, many of them even before our own citizens, and we give them the same level of healthcare apart from vaccines. So these are very difficult ethical questions that we're being asked to resolve. So again, to go back, as you're setting up your fire brigade, you're dealing with each fireman, each fire captain has to deal and decide on some very difficult ethical issues. And there's a whole ethics that's also embedded into the vaccine allocation that was done by WHO, which is also a difficult one. But the bottom line is national partiality is a concept, whether you like it or not, that exists.
Thank you. I think also that's a very, very useful concept for us to take into the discussion and to think about. So with one eye, I've seen that we had quite a lively debate in our chat here, which brings me to my colleague Pavlina Ittelsen to give us a sense of the discussion and perhaps highlight a couple of key questions that have been coming in for our speakers.
Thank you, Katarina. So we had about two areas the participants were discussing. First question was from Richard Hill. Could we also have a discussion or presentations of the request from a large number of developing countries from TRIPS waiver to facilitate increased production of COVID vaccines? I assume Richard alludes to the discussions India and others had at the WTO. And the other group of questions and discussions related to vaccine hesitancy and how does, once the vaccine is available, how does one persuade the public to actually get vaccinated, and whether this equitable distribution question does have an effect on vaccination rates, and what is the role of public policy in this area. There is confirmation from Pamela, Stephanie, from Ginger that there is actually vaccine hesitancy present all around the world. And what could be the diplomatic responses to increase vaccination rates worldwide?
Thank you, Pavlina. Two really, really interesting, very broad issues. So one is obviously the WTO discussion, which kind of feeds into the question of equitable distribution, I assume. And the other question, hesitancy to get vaccinated, and what can diplomacy perhaps do, if anything. So with these two kind of broad themes, I would like to hand back to our two speakers, starting with the ambassador. What is your reaction to these comments and reflections from our audience?
Well, firstly, I think the first question on the waiver proposal, I believe the TRIPS waiver proposal that's been pushed around, it's very interesting. Mike Fauci, the coronavirus czar in the US, he's just warned that forcing drug companies, he gave an interview to Financial Times, forcing drug companies to abandon intellectual property rights to COVID-19 vaccines could actually lead to a lot of legal wrangling and backfiring. And so, he's said that he would oppose a plan to do this TRIPS waiver proposal. And the Biden administration is expected to set out its position, and it's a key player in this regard, given the fact that a lot, what happened with Operation Warp Speed, a lot of the US government-funded vaccines, they're going to set a position out this week. But the question is, what is the goal? If you want to boost vaccine manufacturing and supply to developing countries, how do you do it? It's not just about the TRIPS waiver, about giving a waiver to certain patent rights during this time. It's a much broader issue. It's a much broader and more complex issue that involves, and Mark alluded to it, supply constraints, supply resilience networks. So again, Mark mentioned the Human Rights Council resolution. Singapore was a main sponsor of the Human Rights Council resolution to ensure access for all. So the question is, now if the debate is in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the WTO has got to deal with this. The countries, India and South Africa, have been pushing for the waiver, and other countries, which has raised, and the waiver proposal has raised some pertinent questions. And the new WTO Director General, who was the chairman of Gavi, ex-chairperson of Gavi, so she understands the issues intimately, and she has been negotiating with pharmaceutical companies in a previous position, so she understands all the complexities. So she has basically got to find a way out, whether it's the third way or anything. She's got to find a way out of this, and we've got to work together productively on this. So the other part is that on vaccine hesitancy, I think Mark, I don't want to take the floor away from Mark completely, but I'll just say this on vaccine hesitancy. The bottom line of vaccine hesitancy is that is the infodemic part of the pandemic. And when you have bots and you have all sorts of misinformation and disinformation about vaccines, which is not a new thing, you really have got to find in a very coordinated way, and I think this is where the Human Rights Council can get involved as well, to deal with the issue of vaccine hesitancy, because it impinges on the right to health in a very major way. I'm sure Mark will have a lot to say on that. I'm always interested to hear his views.
Thank you. So over to Mark. What is your reflection on these two very broad, very interesting questions?
No, thank you. Very interesting questions, as you say. Actually, I did allude to the issue of production and research and development in my previous answers. And the reason is because it's crucial. I mean, as I said, the kind of get out of jail free card for developed countries can't be just to say they've given so many million to the COVAX facility. There are much bigger questions about getting vaccines developed, produced, exported, and into people's arms. And actually both of these questions cover different parts of that process or continuum. So well done to those who asked the questions. It's, as the ambassador suggested, it's incredibly difficult, this issue of research and development and waivers, TRIPS waivers. On the one hand, of course, this is a global pandemic which has killed millions of people. And so the kind of moral impulse of any of us is to say, well, look, just share the recipe, share the information on how to develop these vaccines with developing countries, especially the world's poorest countries. Against that, you have, of course, the developed countries, including the United States, who point out that the companies that have developed these vaccines, that's part of a huge ongoing investment in research and development. And these vaccines wouldn't even be here if those companies weren't continuously making these enormous investments in research and development. And so it would be a huge dissuasive act to just then, start handing out the secrets to whoever wants it. Would it also? There's also the question: would it really help? Because if it's one thing for a very poor country or least developed country to have the recipe, but then it's completely something else to actually have the facilities and the capacity to be able to produce the thing. So on that one, I'm just going to say it's very difficult and leave it with the Director General of the World Trade Organization to find the third way, as the ambassador called it. What I just said, by the way, about exporting R&D, that doesn't hold for just exporting the vaccine. There really is no excuse for those countries that are hoarding vaccines. None at all, as far as I can see. In terms of vaccine hesitancy, the ambassador kind of touched upon my answer, and it is one of, well, it's twofold. Firstly, there is the point the ambassador mentioned, which is disinformation, which of course in the age of the internet spreads like wildfire. And especially if it's coming from influential individuals like senior politicians or celebrities that have a large and global reach, then any kind of signal of, oh, you know, is this vaccine safe? Is it okay for my religion to take this vaccine? These kind of signals can have an enormously magnified impact on people. And that's just, you know, disinformation or misinformation. Where it's malicious, where bots or where the different people are trying to create panic and create fear of vaccines, therefore putting people's rights to health and right to life at risk, then you know, it brings back the point that we often raise in other discussions, that the world really does need to take serious action about on the issue of disinformation online. At the moment, there tends to be I won't go too much into this because it's a different discussion, but there's still a tendency from many governments to say the best antidote for disinformation or malicious information is more information. But in the digitalized world, that just doesn't hold anymore, because lies and disinformation and hate speech spread like wildfire, and the damage is done even before we wake up in the morning. So a huge issue. I would also put a more positive spin on it, that a very important thing that I think the United Nations and its member states could do is a more positive information campaign to encourage people to take the vaccine, you know, using celebrities like Angelina Jolie with UNICEF or the ambassador of Singapore for the Human Rights Council, using them to really get to their audiences and say that this is important both for themselves and for society as a whole. So and I don't think, I've not noticed anyway that we're doing much of that, and I think it's a big gap at the moment.
Thank you. As I said, two really important topics, and we just scratched the surface. I'm also seeing in the chat there's still a debate going on both of these issues. And I think it's really interesting because with this debate, we really distilled those two questions, which I think are really key questions going forward. We only have about 4 minutes left. So what I would suggest is perhaps to kind of sum us up and wrap up this debate, a final word from both of you, a final reflection after our 45 minutes of discussion on this really important topic. Mark, why don't you start with just a very, very brief reflection, perhaps even a tweetable reflection?
Okay, tweet. Well, I guess I should end, because I've been a bit critical of certain states. I should end on a positive, and that is that we're having this discussion about vaccine multilateralism. It wasn't at all a given a year ago that there would be this focus on vaccine multilateralism. There would be the COVAX facility. The states would be making a big deal of the fact they've given so many million to COVAX. It wasn't at all given that we would be able to, via UNICEF, get vaccines into people's arms in Africa. So I think the UN actually, as it has done throughout the pandemic, has done very well to raise the human element of the pandemic and the human rights element of it and the equity aspect of it. And it's continuing that now, I think, by pushing vaccine multilateralism. So I would say well done to all of those, including Singapore, that have been involved in this, and that they are right. And all that's left to do now is to convince those countries that that are not playing ball, that this is the right thing to do. But thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And I think your very last word is exactly leading us over to the ambassador. How are we convincing these countries? But also, what is your final reflection?
Well, you want something tweetable, I'll say that this has been a great debate, but I think the title of this debate should not be Diplomatic Responses to COVID-19. What we really need to deal with this pandemic are undiplomatic responses to COVID-19, because an undiplomatic approach may sometimes get more done. And I speak as a fully fledged, card-carrying, long-serving diplomat and ambassador. But to break the cycle, especially of panic and neglect in global healthcare, the human tendency to always just deal with the issue in front of us and then let it fester, and then until it comes back again, that can't go on. We need to change. And this way of approaching pandemics, which, like climate change, is going to change the world as we know it if we don't deal with it proactively. The International Panel on Pandemic Response and Preparedness is going to present some fascinating recommendations in the next 2-3 weeks. So look out for that, what they propose in a raft of areas for WHO reform, for the way we epidemiologically survey in a coordinated way what's happening in terms of spillover, in terms of One Health, in terms of how to reform the international health regulations, how to reform the way pandemic alerts are done. So I think that's very important. And each nation must play its own part to strengthen its defense. Again, going back to the tension between the national and international. But it's clear, and that's why Singapore's always pushed for vaccine multilateralism, and we call it vaccine multilateralism, but that's a broad brush umbrella term for strengthening the existing multilateral response, strengthening multilateral institutions. We need a more reliable system to prevent pandemics, to deal with it once they come. We can't keep putting together this fire brigade each time it comes. It's not going to work. So yes, if it gets us results, let's be more undiplomatic. And the other thing I want to mention finally is that on the whole question of TRIPS waivers and the question of intellectual property and patents, let's put our minds not to an ideological cast, but to how can we get to the end goal of getting more shots into arms? And whatever it takes, let's do it, because that's what we need to do to save lives, to get the economy back on track, which also is all about giving people livelihoods. So that's my sort of like closing shot. Thank you. My parting shots, no pun intended.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fantastic debate. I enjoyed it very much. So first of all, thank you to our guests, Ambassador Bhatia and Mr. Mark Lyman. Thank you for joining us, and also our audience for a very rich, at times controversial discussion in the chat. As always, we will follow up with the summary and the recording of this debate, and we will continue the discussion from there. For now, thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Katerina.
Thank you.
Great to see Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Good to see you all. Bye.
Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Bye.